I used to travel a lot, but thanks to the current global crisis, I sadly can't. After going through a few of my travel scrapbooks, I was reminded of a story an old man in Germany told me. I don't know if this story is true, but looking at the mythical history of the Black Forest, I am actually leaning towards true. I'll be telling his story from the perspective from the old man. I walked into the bar of the hotel I was staying at after a long day hard work, ordering a beer for me and my colleague. After a few hours, my colleague went to bed. I stayed to get a few more beers in. The old man walked in and the bartender told me this old man comes here every night and tells the craziest war stories. The old man walked up to the bar and I noticed then it was just me, and the old man left in the bar with the bartender. The old man ordered a beer like me and started talking to me. I was in the war, and even then things weren't as crazy as now. I looked at the old man asking him, "You were in the war?" After which he said, "Yes, and I'm staying in this hotel today as well." The old man and I started talking, and then we got to a story about his wartime. Well, I was a part of a high elite resistance unit, and something weird happened once that I believe will finally catch up with me tonight. I asked him to tell the story, and this is what he said. "Well, young man, I will tell you, this might be hard to believe, but trust me, this still is going on to this night. My higher-ups told me that there was a Nazi camp in the Black Forest, and that my unit had to intercept and kill them. We walked to the Black Forest in full attire, so we had all our ammo, food, and things like that to survive the whole mission. After 4 days of staking out the area, we finally found the camp of the Nazis. We staked out the walking guards and took down a few of them. As we turned our strategy more aggressive, it's where we went wrong as a unit. We started shooting and killing Nazis, but it didn't come without a cost. After all the shooting, we all started to see that Guggenheimer was shot, and we started to leave the Nazi camp. Of course, we raided the camp for ammo and food as well. Guggenheimer was bleeding pretty bad for those days, so we had to get him back to the base within 2 days tops. The first day we kept walking, carrying Guggenheimer for that entire day, and decided that we needed to set up camp to get some rest that night. I decided to be the third in order for the night watch. Nothing much happened besides the boar I killed and stripped as food for the following night. Guggenheimer was getting worse by the second, and the rest of the unit started praying, saying, "Anyone that can hear us, save our friend, please." And my God, did I wish that we were more accurate with who we were praying to. We walked to the base again, but a lot of Nazi forces were around us, so we had to take another route, which would cause us another day to get to base. We set up camp eating the boar I killed the day earlier, but Guggenheimer was getting so worse, we started thinking that we weren't going to be able to save our friend. As a 8-people unit, losing a soldier was pretty hard to get our heads around since we were a pretty close unit. I had the third guard duty again, and when it was my turn, I checked the whole area. After about 30 minutes, I needed to go really hard, so I walked behind a tree and relieved myself. As I pulled up my pants and started to get myself perfect again, I started to say a prayer. To anyone out there, please help my friend Guggenheimer to survive his terrible injuries, amen. I was a little lightheaded getting up and was gaining myself while starting to walk back to the rest of the unit. I then noticed a mass hanging over Guggenheimer, and I started walking towards it, getting my rifle ready to fire, to slowly walk to the figure, saying, "Get away or I will kill you." It was then I saw the old man actually shedding a tear and wanted to ask for another beer. I told the bartender to put that beer on my tab, and the old man thanked me and continued. As I walked up to the figure hanging over Guggenheimer, it seemed to ignore me. All it did was flinging his hands over the body of Guggenheimer, and then it seemed that it started to notice me. As I walked up to it with my gun ready to fire, it started to get up and said, "Your friend is saved." It stood at least 2 meters tall and turned its head to mine. "I will collect what is mine for this prayer for this man." And as I saw red eyes staring into mine, I was starting to tremble. It then turned around and slowly started walking into the woods. I checked on Guggenheimer but couldn't see anything weird, and then started looking around for the creature. It was nowhere to be found. But then I was startled by Wilhoker putting his hand on my shoulder. He just nodded and said, "Guten Nacht." I went to bed that night just thinking about that creature. As the next day came, Guggenheimer was actually starting it to improve. We finally arrived at the base 3 days after Guggenheimer got shot, and the doctor asked us why we sent Guggenheimer to him. Our mouth hit the floor from that reaction from the doctor when he said that Guggenheimer could be operational within a week was a huge surprise to our unit. A few days later, and we were given another mission in the Black Forest. Guggenheimer was fully healed and ready to go, as was I and the rest of the unit. We were supposed to check the Black Forest for another camp, but were only supposed to be a recon mission. As we walked through the Black Forest, we all noticed Guggenheimer was acting different from what we were used to. After 3 days of recon, we once again went set up camp. Guggenheimer was acting more and more weirder, almost more violent throughout those days. We once again set up the night watch schedule and I was first. A few hours in, I just couldn't hold it any longer and went number 2 in the forest. After I finished, I saw Guggenheimer stalking around, asking him, "Hey friend, what are you doing?" He didn't react, so I walked to him. I saw him cutting the throat of Wilhelmer, just smiling. He then rushed me with the knife, waking Muller, who just grabbed Guggenheimer and knocked him out. It was then that we found out that he had killed all but Muller, Gerheimler, and me, so we tied up Guggenheimer. After we tied him up, though, I saw then that same creature a few meters away from where I was standing and told the other guys to look at it. Strangely, they couldn't see him, but then I couldn't see it anymore again. We went to the camp, turned in Guggenheimer, and our unit disbanded. Of course, we kept in contact. Guggenheimer strangely died from the wounds he had suffered from the earlier Black Forest Nazi camp mission, which all of us thought weird. Muller was found with his throat slit, and Gerheimler was found dead with a huge handprint on his throat that looked like a burn. The old man took another sip of his beer and said, "I fear I am the last one of our unit, and I fear my payment for that prayer is due." As the old man drank the last drops out of the beer glass, he just said, "Young man, I fear this night might be my last, but I heard you wanted to go to the Black Forest." The old man put the glass on the table and continued saying, "Be careful to who you pray to, and be specific because you might just end like my unit." He then walked to the opening that separated the bar and the hotel areas, smiled and said, "Have a good life, young man." The next day I was woken by a scream, to which I walked straight to only see the old man lying dead in the bed with a smile on his face. But then I noticed a huge dark red hand-like print on his throat. I've always heard stories about the Black Forest in Germany, and its many mythical and paranormal encounters, and I seriously believe that whatever caused the death of that old man wasn't natural, but the creature he mentioned in his stories. So if I might suggest anything to people going into the Black Forest in Germany, it would be this: be careful to who you pray to in that forest, because you might just end up like that old man or worse. This took place 2 years back during the summer I had graduated high school. Since the end of that summer, I've moved to North Carolina for college at the State University. This incident took place in New York, however. Anyway, to give some basic context, my high school was in a suburban setting, but the campus was surrounded by a good amount of forest. I joined the cross-country team in 9th grade, and that kind of developed my love for hiking and exploring. Often we would run on the trails that are dispersed through the forest, especially behind the high school. Some of these trails stretched for many miles. I recall the one day our coach had missed practice after school due to being sick. Our team captain told us we could basically free roam the forest that day, and explore the forest in our own groups if we desired. This was the day I knew I would always have a desire to explore the unknown. That day, me and my friends were jogging around on unused trails, and came across an old shack with various old tools and weapons. Nothing was unordinary besides the fact that there were a bunch of things like axes and daggers hidden inside this place, all of which were mostly in old and brittle condition. The area was abandoned and in the middle of the forest. No one seemed to have come here in a while. We didn't think much of it and labeled it as a good find. Later on that day, after cross-country practice, me and 2 of my friends came back to the high school to explore some more. This time we went in the complete opposite direction of where the shack was, and ended up finding an abandoned trailer this time. The trailer would have been that sort that you would see on the back of semis. It was at the point of dilapidation and really had nothing left to offer, yet there was no truck in sight. That made us wonder how it got into the woods in the first place, without a clear path long enough to even transport to this location. Next to the back of the truck, a single-story makeshift-looking house that was clearly the victim of a fire. The place was practically crumbling and nothing inside was worth taking a look at. However, the trailer had some interesting stuff inside. Although it was peculiar finding this stuff deep in the woods, a lot of the stuff inside the trailer was either junk that appeared to be old, and antiques that ranged from typewriters to dressers that appeared to be made back in the 1900s. We labeled this as our biggest find yet, and were really excited. That wrapped up that day, though. A lot of other cool and odd things had happened in our expeditions to the forest since then, but nothing as bizarre and freakish as what I am about to tell you guys. So the purpose of stating all this basically was to explain how my love for hiking and exploring came into play. Since then, me and my friends have continued to go to this forest behind the high school from time to time. So now, as officially graduated seniors, me and my friends decided to have one last time in those woods before we split off in our own unique directions in life. While it was a day filled with deep nostalgia and sadness, reminiscing the good old days, we also got the fright of our life. This time we dedicated the whole day to the woods. We got ready in the morning and rode our mountain bikes into the woods, bringing camp supplies and such. This day was different. We decided we were going to camp overnight in the woods. There were 4 of us in total. We told our parents we were going over to stay the night at one of our other friends' houses. Looking back, I kind of wish that's what we ended up doing, though. So we got there in the morning and found an area to set up camp. It was at the bottom of a really steep elevation, and there was a clearing at the bottom with an already made fire pit because apparently someone had been there in the past already. There were beer cans and ammunition shells scattered everywhere. I've come to learn that this area of the forest was actually used as a shooting range back in the day. We started on our hike and basically joked around all day. We graffitied a bridge about a mile down the trail where our campsite was, writing stuff like "so-and-so was here" and just joking around. We figured he had to document our last day and all the other days we had spent in this awesome forest before we all left for college. Pretty much when you entered the forest there was a main path, then went straight with many side paths. The area where we camped was about a quarter mile into the trail from the high school to the left. If you kept going straight on the main path, you would eventually get to the bridge where we had our little art exhibit. To the left was where the shack was, and to the right was where the trailer was on each of their own paths. And if you went straight past the old broken bridge, you'd go further into the woods, where much more trails could be located. The day went well with absolutely nothing going wrong. We hadn't run into anyone else, thankfully, because a lot of the stuff we ended up doing was definitely not allowed on private property. It was getting dark at this point, and we began to get ready for our campfire. Beers in hand and memories on our mind, we had started our nostalgia trip. Things had been going great. At one point, the fire had begun to die down, and we decided to let it go. After all, the embers would stay alive for a while after, and that was all we really needed at this point. It was around 1 in the morning at this point, and we had all fallen asleep. At some point, I suddenly woke up not knowing what time it was. Everyone else appeared to be asleep, though. I didn't move much, though, because shortly after I had woken up, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps crunching on beer cans and earth. I truthfully couldn't tell if it was on 2 feet or 4, but I just assumed it was an animal walking around the campsite in search of food or something. That's when I realized we were complete idiots for not cleaning up after ourselves and putting our stuff away. But no, I was far from guessing right. At least I think I was. I hadn't made a single motion since I had woken, and even worse, whatever was near us, it was not facing in my direction, so I was completely vulnerable to whatever this thing was. That's when I heard a new set of footsteps approaching the campsite. I heard nothing else besides these footsteps. This is when I knew that whatever these things were, they were bipedal. The crickets and frogs in this area ceased to make noise at this point. A few moments later, everything was dead silent, even the noise of whoever was in our camping area. I instantly got up and woke up my friends. It had been about an hour. It was around 2 in the morning now, and I noticed that the embers had been put out by water, and the smoke was wafting into the air. That must have happened right before I woke up. We were all awake at this point, seriously questioning what the heck was happening. All I could say was I heard footsteps by our campsite, but they were audibly gone now. Out of nowhere, an ear-piercing scream shot out into the air from the path taken to get to our camp spot at the higher elevation. As I looked into that general direction, I could see at the top of the trail something looking down at us. Another scream rang out. It almost sounded like an Aztec death whistle if I were to compare it to something, yet it was much lower in tone, with an almost insect-like clicking noise to it. We were in utter shock, unable to move. That's when it hit me. Where was the other thing? It had accompanied that figure at the camp. Was it near us? I never found out. Whatever was at the top of the trail had now begun to skulk off further deep into the woods towards the bridge. All I could make out was its tall, slender silhouette. Where its eyes were supposed to be were two small, eerily green reflecting slits. I was scared beyond my wits at this point and told everyone we were going to make a run for it. After all, we weren't too far from the high school, only a quarter mile. We ditched everything and fled. We decided we would come back for anything we left the next day with a bigger group of people. We ran straight out of the woods, not hearing anything else besides our footsteps. We all sneaked into my friend's basement and stayed there for the rest of the night, making sure to lock and secure any form of entry out of paranoia. Never in my life had I experienced something as terrifying as that. Never in my life had I seen or heard anything remotely similar to the sound of that thing we heard that night. We went back 2 days later and found everything there intact. However, 2 of the 4 bikes had been completely destroyed, scattered among the already littered ground of beer cans and ammunition shells. Our sleeping bags were shredded and slung upon tree branches way up high. Everything was just a disturbing mess. The forest had been resorted with its sound of nature, though signifying that anything dangerous was most likely far off. We took the 2 remaining bikes back home and anything else we were able to salvage. Whatever was out there that night had come back in attempt to find us again, but only found the remains of what we left behind. What I'll never know is why those things were near our camp or in the forest, and what their ultimate goal was in coming near us. I still have trouble thinking about to this day, but I know deep down that whatever it was, there was no chance it wasn't pure evil. This happened about 2 weeks ago, and I am still terrified as I write this. For those of you who haven't read my story, let me give you some back history really quick. My dad has a cabin in northern West Virginia, a couple counties over from Point Pleasant. Now, my husband and I had an experience a couple years ago that scared us so badly that we have refused to go back to that place. Well, my dad lets one of his buddies that lives in town grow Christmas trees on his property because it's farmland. But my dad doesn't farm the land. He just uses the cabin as a getaway and for hunting. When his buddy goes to harvest the trees, my dad goes up to help out, and in return gets however many trees he wants. My stepmom usually is always by his side, but she had came down with a brutal type of flu and couldn't go this time. My dad asked if my husband and I would go this trip and help out, but we refused at first. Then I got to thinking and feeling guilty because my dad isn't in the best of health anymore. When my 19-year-old brother passed away, it completely destroyed him, and he had a light heart attack, and since then his heart isn't the best. Well, I talked it over with my husband and he said it was up to me. I called my mom to see if she could keep our kids for the weekend, and she said yes. I called my dad and told him we would be going to help him. That night I took the kids to mom's, packed and loaded our gear with my own pistol and my trusty .22 rifle. I have other guns, but my .22 is light and never failed me yet. My husband also packed his pistol and rifle. We were going prepared this time, just in case anything happened. The next morning we met Dad and set out on our journey up north. 5 hours of driving, we finally come to the dirt road turnoff, and I will admit my stomach sank and I started to sweat. I could tell my husband, Neil, was feeling scared too. We get to the cabin, unpack our things, and we change into warmer clothes and put coveralls over them. I load my pistol and place it inside its holster in my side, and load my rifle and sling it off my shoulder. This is the normal thing to do at the cabin when you're going into the woods because of all the wild animals. I could handle any animal, it was the thing from that night that I was worried about. We go outside and set out on the ATVs. The Christmas trees was on the other side of the property. When we get there, we notice my dad's buddy isn't there yet, and I ask if he called him before we left the cabin, to which he hangs his head and says no. I tell Dad to go back and call him what time we wait where we were, just in case someone showed up. He agrees and sets out back towards the cabin. We are left alone in the middle of this Christmas tree forest. I get off the ATV to stretch my legs, and Neil needs to use the bathroom. So he goes a little ways away to do that. As I am standing there, I notice everything is quite, dead quiet. No birds, no insects, no nothing, not even the wind is blowing. I get this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it feels like I'm being watched. My heart was in my throat, and I was getting so nervous I was starting to shake. I yelled for Neil and nothing. I walked a little in the direction he went and yelled for him again. Nothing still. At this point, I knew something wasn't right. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement among the trees. I stopped and stood still as I could. The quiet was defending. I heard the trees behind me move, and I turned to look, and all I saw was a tall, shadowy figure moving beyond the pine trees. I was beyond scared and screamed Neil's name once more, but he still didn't answer me. I ran for the ATV, got on it, geared down to start it, reached for the key, but there was only air. I looked down to find no key in the starter. My stomach sank. Neil must have taken it with him. I knew how to hotwire it, but my hands were shaking so badly, and the time it would take me to hotwire this thing, something could be up on me in no time. My heart was beating like a wild drum, and I took a deep breath, knowing I had two choices. One, I could go into the woods to look for Neil and risk coming in contact with whatever that shadow was, or I could set off on foot back toward the cabin to get my dad. My mind was racing. My choices was made. I was going to walk back to the cabin to get my dad, then we could come look for Neil. I hopped off the ATV and took on step towards the way back to the cabin, and then I heard it. A faint, "Help me." It was coming from the forest. Tears started streaming down my face, and I turned and started to run towards Neil's voice. I screamed at Neil to keep yelling so I could find him. I was running, and branches were slapping me in the face and my body, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear I was getting close because his voice was growing louder. I kept running toward it. Then I found him. He was sitting against a tree with blood streaming down his face. I ran to him and asked what happened. Neil said something big hit him, and that was all he remembered. He had blacked out. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew we couldn't stay in these woods. I told Neil, "I'm going to help you up, and we are getting the hell out of here." Finally, after a few minutes of pulling and lifting, I got him to his feet. We started walking slowly back through the woods to the ATV. Then we heard it. Something running through the trees. We looked at each other and tried to move faster. We kept going, still hearing that thing going right along beside us. We made it to the forest clearing, and we could see the ATV. Neil said to lean him against one of the trees and go get the ATV. I did as he said. When he was safely against the tree, I turned to go towards the ATV and ran into a wall. I looked up and I saw a huge thing standing at least 7 foot tall, and it had hair everywhere. It looked down at me with its hell-colored red embers. I was so terrified that I couldn't move at all. All I could do was stare, and I saw this thing had wings. Black wings that went all the way down to the ground. Neil screamed at me, and I awoke from my shock and my mind went blank. I moved around the creature and made a mad dash towards the ATV. I was almost there until something grabbed my shoulder. I looked and saw this huge claw-like talons, and then I was thrown backwards into a huge pine tree. Before I passed out, I heard a hymn shot ring out, and then another, and then nothing but total darkness. I awoke sometime later and found myself laying on the bed at the cabin. I tried to move, but everything hurt, and my dad came into the room. He looked at me and said, "Don't move, young'un, or you will hurt yourself." I didn't need to be told twice. I looked at Dad and asked what had happened. He said as I was running toward the ATV, him and his friend seen the creature right behind me, and as it threw me backward, him and his friend unloaded their shotguns into it. He was silent after that, and I asked what happened after that. Dad looked at me with the color gone from his face and said, "That damn thing looked at both of us with these fire-like eyes, spread its wings, let out this god-awful scream, and leaped straight up in the sky and flew away. We don't know what that creature was, but I have a feeling it was the creature from our first night at the cabin all those years ago." Since then, Dad has forbid anybody to go there. Even his buddy with the pine trees said he wouldn't be back there. As for Neil, he recovered and is doing well, but I can't say the same for myself. When that creature grabbed my shoulder, it sunk its claws into me. The claw marks are slowly healing, but I have been noticing some changes. Like last night, I found 2 knots on my shoulder blades, and I am growing hair at an alarming rate. I honestly don't know what's going on with me, or what will happen. I can tell you this, though, I am more terrified than I have ever been in my life. To give this story some context, I need to state a few details about myself. My name is Jay, and I am 17 years old from the UK. I had a close friend. We will call him John for privacy reasons. From the age of 13, 16, he was my closest friend, and we did everything together. We were both massively into wilderness survival, so we planned a trip to Scotland to spend a week alone in the forest to get a real survival experience. We were both really excited and invested in all the equipment needed to bring with us, as our parents wouldn't let us go without the correct safety measures. To give a brief idea of what we took, here is a list of the main items we took: a tent, a small combat knife each, a camping stove, rations, and miscellaneous items such as rope, blankets, etc. After a long, dull 10-hour car journey, we eventually made it to the edge of the forest we were set to venture in. My heart raced with excitement as I stared into the forest ahead. It was a lush green with flowers scattered around the floor. It was everything I imagined and more. We lugged our rucksacks onto our backs and started the long walk to where we planned to camp. It was a good 8-mile hike to get to the loch we planned to camp near. I believe it was called Loch and Rye or something along those lines, so we were ready for a 3 to 4 hour walk. This didn't faze me at all, as I was so excited that I'd finally get to camp in the wild, as where I live there are no real places that you can camp away from other people. John was equally as happy as I was, with a wide smile across his face. After about an hour of walking, we stopped to take a break and had something to eat and drink. We were sat on a large rock in the middle of a clearing in the woods. Surprisingly, it was a nice day, and the sun was shining through the trees onto us. As we ate, we noticed a deer carcass about 20 feet away. Upon closer inspection, we found out that it was pretty fresh, a day or 2 old at most, and the way it had died was most definitely not natural. A large deep gash ran across its neck, and its hooves had been cut off, as well as its eyes being removed, leaving deep empty sockets with flies buzzing in and out. Me and John were curious to what had truly happened, but just guessed that it was some messed up kids or something, as we were only an hour deep into the forest. After that encounter, we moved on and completely forgot about it. After another 3 hours of walking, we arrived at the loch. It was a beautiful clear body of water, with large fish swimming around. We found a flat patch of land and proceeded to set up our camp as the night was drawing close. After about half an hour, we had camp set up and a fire made. After a quick meal, we went straight to bed as we were exhausted from the walk. For the first few days, nothing suspicious happened. We just built shelters and hunted to our heart's content. But on the 4th night, I left the camp to take a pee. After walking a good 50 meters away, I stopped to pee. When I looked up, I was horrified to see another deer, exactly the same as the one that me and John found on the way here. I shrieked and ran back to our camp. My heart was racing as I thought of all the reasons why it could have been there. And that close to our camp, what was happening? What if whoever did that finds us? Will we suffer a similar fate? I returned to find John putting the fire out, and he was about to get into the tent. I caught my breath, and John asked what was up. I grabbed him and jumped into the tent. "What are you doing?" John said in his usual loud voice. I hushed him and explained about the deer. He laughed and brushed it off as a joke, thinking that I was trying to scare him. I tried telling him that I wasn't joking, but he just laughed and said, "Prove it." There was no chance in hell that I was going back in that direction. As John reached for the zipper on the tent, a faint chanting started. It must have been in the distance, but it was enough to spook us both. We both grabbed for our little combat knives and clutched them as if would bring us safety. The chanting grew louder and louder, and we decided that we needed to get the hell out of there. We grabbed our small emergency rucksacks and unzipped the tent door. To our horror, there was around 4 cloaked figures just 15 feet away from us. We both froze in horror for a moment until one of the figures started to move forward. We freaked out and bolted away. But there was more of these figures on the other side of our tent. We dashed through 2 of the smaller-looking figures, then we ran for our lives. I glanced back only to see the figures keeping pace with us, but they had now revealed that they were wielding jagged knives. This sight made my heart sink, and I pushed my legs as hard as I could. The next time we looked back, we had finally lost them. My heart was racing. What kind of sick people would do that? Was it some kind of sick joke? I was glad that I escaped with my life, as I know that I am not the strongest runner. John looked at me with fear still in his eyes and asked, "What the hell just happened?" I couldn't reply as I was so exhausted from running. We spent the rest of the night hiding up a tree until the sun rose. Then we immediately went back to the road and called to be picked up, leaving all our gear behind. We didn't report it to the police as we thought they simply wouldn't believe us. To this day, I still wonder what those people were actually doing out there. Was it simply animal sacrifices or worse? Until now, I haven't been able to share my story as I thought no one would believe me. But after finding this channel, I feel comfortable to share, and I may even share some of my other experiences as I seem to be a magnet for creepy people. Never thought something like this would happen to me. I've grown up in the woods my whole life and never once had a scary experience. My name's Tess and I am 22 and live in Ontario, Canada. My parents live out in the wilderness and have 2 properties, one with their house on it and the other down the road with 200 acres with a long trail that leads about 100 acres into a private lake. We regularly take ATVs out and ride them to the lake to fish, swim, and relax on the dock with a cold one. Lately, I lost my job due to the pandemic, so I moved out of my apartment and drove up north to stay with my parents until it is over. Luckily, my other siblings haven't lost their jobs, so they still are in the city, but one of my brothers came up for a long weekend to fish with my dad, and they went ahead on the 2 of our 3 ATVs to the lake. I decided to join and follow after them, but the 3rd ATV was giving me trouble. I checked the gas and it was full, tried to pull start it, but no luck. So I told my mom I'd take my car and park at the front of the 200-acre and walk into the lake. It was a beautiful day, so I didn't mind a nice long sunny walk, then go for a cool swim. So I hopped in my car and drove over, parked, and set off on the path, my phone playing music to scare away any animals on my way, or so I thought it would. Usually takes 50 minutes to walk into the lake. 35, maybe 40 if you run down the crude trail. I was at a fast-paced walk, enjoying the views and music, and about 20 minutes into the walk, when I heard voices to my left in the woods. I turned off my music to listen. Sometimes my family would go off trail on ATVs, so I called out to see if it was my dad and brother wandering around. I got no reply and heard no engine noises, so I kept walking. A minute later, I saw something run across the path ahead on all 4s, and I stopped in my tracks. It was big. A wolf, a deer, maybe a bear. I couldn't be sure, but I started to back away slowly and stand tall like you should when confronted with an animal. I looked around the forest and noticed how silent it had gotten. Not even wind to rustle the leaves in the trees. My hair was all standing on end on my arms, and goosebumps trailed up my arms and legs. I felt like I was in danger. My head on a swivel, I kept looking around me, trying to identify where the treat was coming from, until I heard footsteps from right behind me. I jerked around, and 20 feet away stood this tall thing, gray skin and bony. It was so big, as tall as a small house, about 9 feet, while it stood upright on 2 hooves, and it had antlers that were white and yellow. It looked like it was decaying, and its head looped to one side, arms falling past its knees, and it had hollow eye sockets, but it felt like they were looking into my soul. But my eyes went down and focused on the thing's hands. It had bony human hands, and they looked like they were prepared to reach out to me. My voice was caught in my throat, and flight instinct pushed me into a full-out run right down the path in the direction on the lake. I heard it behind me, almost like it wasn't even trying to keep pace with me, waiting for me to tire out. I was so panicked, I didn't even realize I had lost track of the trail I used to be on, and was now jumping through the brush of the forest until I got my foot stuck in between a fallen tree's branches. I looked back. and the thing was still coming and I had no time. So I slipped my foot out from my shoe and kept going until I reached a clearing filled with tall grass. At this point I was so tired and breathing hard, so I ran. Then I crawled into a patch of thick grass and weeds and tried to steady my breath as the thing entered the edge of the clearing seconds later. It stayed just on the edge, looking around the clearing with its hollow gaze, when I heard what I thought was laughter. It was like a chuckle that sounded rattling, like chuck, chuck, chuck. Then it spoke in a voice all too familiar to me, my father's voice. "Come out, small one." It took a step towards the other side of the clearing I wasn't on. "I need your help with something." I was trembling and trying to hold my panic and tears falling down my face. Then a sound off in the forest drew its attention and it ran out of the clearing so fast towards it I barely had time to register that it was gone. I lay there quiet and still, I don't know how long, until I heard the forest come alive with noise, like it woke up around me. I stood cautiously, feeling a painful twinge in my ankle and looking down to see an angry bruise starting to form from when I got it caught in that damn tree. I wasn't sure where I came from, and I know they say to stay put if you're lost in the forest, but there was no way I was waiting for that thing to come back. I looked at some trees to get my bearing of which way is north. My parents taught me that moss mostly grows on the north side of the trees, so I had the general direction of north. And when I looked up to the sky, the sun was getting low, so I couldn't see it through the trees, but the way the light was coming, I knew that was west. Since the lake is southeast and I was running in that direction, I would want to go northwest to get back to the road and to my car. So I walked/limped in that direction, still looking around, holding my breath every time the forest seemed too quiet, then letting it out when I heard a bird's call or a squirrel chitter. It took about an hour since I had to fix my direction every now and again, and the forest has bogs and thick brush which is hard to navigate with a hurt ankle and lack of a shoe. But I made it out onto the road a long ways away from the front entrance of the property. I went down the road to the entrance of the property where I heard my name being called by my dad. At first I didn't answer, scared the thing was back. But then I saw his ATV parked beside my car, and I hobbled and ran to him. He hugged, then looked at me and asked what happened, seeing my tear-lined face and lack of shoe. I told him I was chased by something through the forest, and I got turned around. He told me my brother was riding around the trail to look for me, and we had to wait for him, but I asked to wait in the car. I felt unsafe out in the open, and felt like we were being watched constantly. He agreed and sat with me in the car until my brother showed up 20 minutes later, but in those 20 minutes I told my dad the whole story. He was very quiet and told me not to say anything to my brother when he showed up, so not to spook him. My brother ran around the car and opened the door and gave me a hug because he was worried. They asked if I needed to go to the hospital, looking at my foot, but I didn't think it was that serious. So we went back to my parents' house. It was my left foot, so I could drive back to the house without issue, and they took the ATVs. I drove back shakily, just wanting to feel safe inside a building with family present. When we arrived at the house after I parked, I got out of the car and saw that outside the house on the porch was my shoe, the one I lost in the forest. I saw it and started to break down into tears, and my brother was so confused, but my dad hugged me and took me inside. I ended up telling my mom and brother what happened. My dad just didn't want to freak my brother out at the time because he was ATVing alone looking for me. I iced my foot and thankfully didn't need a doctor, and we did some research. Well, my brother did it mostly and ended up calling a shaman to come bless my parents' properties a few days later. The shaman also gave me an amulet carved from wood and told me to wear it when I'm in the forest to protect me from the evil spirits. He was very adamant about me wearing it. If what I saw was an evil spirit, I plan on never being alone in the woods again, and it has become a part of my day to put on this amulet before I go outside. So far, nothing else has happened, and I'm thankful to say I haven't seen that thing again since that encounter 2 months ago. I feel like I've lived through a horror movie, and I can say I hated every second of it. I still can't get the thing's rattling laugh out of my head. Deer season was approaching its eve, and being the avid hunter I once was, I readied my algorithm of scents, calls, and supplies. The first day of deer season I was sure to be out there. Hunting was a passion of mine. I enjoyed it, but not as a game. I respected my kill. I was quite thankful for the meat and game provided by my prey. Perhaps it was in my blood. I happened to live in the perfect place for it. The deep Midwest, dense with evergreens of every variety. There were rolling hills and creeks around every bend. The deer here were plentiful, and when I couldn't hunt, I enjoyed watching them as they came upon my land to graze, a temporary haven until their destined time. This region had never known wolves, mountain lions, or even coyotes for as long as I could remember. If it weren't for me, the deer would have lived in paradise here. Needless to say, the nearest city center was several miles away, and so was my nearest neighbor. I enjoyed the serenity that I was constantly immersed in. I avoided horror films and ghost stories. Living out here with such things on your mind would soon drive you mad. Here, it was dark at night, truly dark. Light was so absent some nights that, had I been placed randomly in the woods near my home, I'd be lost until sunrise. This particular deer season was promising. The bucks that I had been seeing were majestic and their points numerous. I was so anxious for the season to approach that I found it hard to sleep. Luckily, I had a means through which to tide myself over until the dawn of this year's hunt. I had an old deer cam my father gave to me many birthdays ago. I used it every year, but I always waited until the last week before deer season so I could see all of the populous fauna of the forests. One morning before the early hues of purple fled the sky, I waded through dew-laden grass and weeds until I found my usual spot. It was an exemplary angle. The view was downhill, overlooking a babbling brook that beckoned the wildlife like moths to a flame. Few were the trees and obstacles that obstructed this view. A professional photographer would die for such scenery, yet I was the lucky participant. Strapping the gadget to the tree was simple and quick. It was almost odd being done so quickly after such a long, refreshing walk to this spot. For a moment I just took in the surroundings, breathing untainted air and sensing a time when man was not. Peace. I walked home quickly, as if the faster I made it back, the sooner the week would pass, and I would be able to enjoy the hunt. That week drudged by ever slowly. It was filled with monotonous chores and television that I was unable to focus on, but finally my day did come. I was up again when the morning mimicked twilight and the foliage attempted to soak through to your toes. This was what I lived for, the countenance of life in every inhale. I made my way past where I laid the deer cam. The mechanism sensed me and made a click sound so subtle that a pin's fall would drown it out. I suppressed a laugh and continued on about 70 yards. This would be where I sat and waited for my prey. Something felt off. The noiselessness of the forest was apprehensive. Such ambience was better placed at an empty funeral. I shifted, cracking a dead leaf under me. The sound resonated throughout the woods, the trees only making the noise more buoyant. I felt stupid. If the deer heard too much of that, my hunt would be futile. I leaned my head against the tree I was seated beneath. The bark was hard and unforgiving, but such were the inconveniences that led to triumph. I felt up the rifle at my side, reassuring myself that the safety was not on. I had loaded it before heading out, not taking the chance to have to ready the damned thing if I saw a trophy buck on the way here. The sound of a twig breaking behind me stole my attention. An involuntary smile overwhelmed me as I nearly shook with excitement. I assumed a deer had snuck up on me. It was unaware of my presence, but little did it know it had just given itself away. My hands were glued to the rifle, ever vigilant for the moment to strike. The sound came closer and closer, the forest floor echoing the creature's approach. Soon the sound was just behind the tree where I sat, waiting. I could even hear breathing, deep and slow. I almost wanted to yell, to tell it to stand in front of me. It seemed to be taking its sweet time to show itself. The breathing stopped and my heart sank. Was it gone? No, it couldn't have been. I would have heard it. Maybe it was holding its breath and listening for imminent danger. If so, it would certainly have to breathe again. But it didn't. I waited for a half hour, my rear becoming sore from my unchanging position. The thing was gone, and it had somehow eluded me. I was frustrated. I turned my head slowly, revolving my skull around the tree like disagreeing cogs. I saw the forest abruptly behind me, and there was nothing. The same noiselessness remained, and there seemed to never have been another presence at all. I stood up. The hair on the back of my neck did the same. I wasn't scared, per se. I was simply uneasy. Because as I checked the soil where the sounds emerged, there was no evidence, no tracks of any kind. What the hell did I hear? My skin became gooseflesh as instinct forced my gaze in every direction. Compulsively I looked up, as if the thing had silently crawled up the tree, but the thin branches were as empty of a presence as they were of leaves. The all too familiar sound came again from my left. Crack, this time from the right. Crack. The sounds were coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I started running, carelessly waving my rifle in a frenzy to escape the unoriginated noise. But the sound followed me, never growing distant or close as I ran. I wasn't sure if it was the brisk, chilly wind against my face or the fear growing inside me, but tears protruded from my eyes and flowed over my cheeks. Suddenly the sound stopped. I stopped as well, fear never leaving me. I could not continue when I did not know what, where, or why of my situation. I began to feel a breeze pick up on my right side, gently blowing over my ear, almost forming a hush sound. I listened closely, ready for another crack in the distance, but it never came. The wind picked up and a new sound came with it. Not just a sound, but a voice. I ran harder than before, my heart aching painfully with each palpitation. If this strange presence didn't kill me, the stress certainly would. The walk there that took a good hour, I ran within 10 minutes. When I reached my house, I opened and slammed the door shut. I even locked the deadbolt. No one around for miles, and I was locking my door from something. Eventually, I calmed down. I watched some TV to take my mind off of things. After being so excited to get out there, it was a weird feeling for me to rather stay inside all day. It just didn't feel safe out there. I thought I was just spooked, but a good night's rest would alleviate the anxiety and suspense. That night, it was extremely difficult to sleep. My room was hardly dark, illuminated by a lamp-made makeshift nightlight. The windows were closed and blinded out of paranoia. There was still rampant fear left in me, and I didn't want to take any chances. By God, I was going to enjoy this season, I told myself. In spite of my stress, my tossing and turning was only aided by a strange clicking sound coming from somewhere in my room. I couldn't place it, but it came every few seconds. It wasn't very loud, and soon I was able to drown it out with thoughts, and quickly those thoughts became dreams. Somehow, I actually felt rejuvenated when I awoke. The morning sun broke gently through the blinds of my bedroom windows, the warmth of its rays splashing ever so pleasantly against my bare skin. I got out of bed and made my way to the door, yawning and stretching as I went. Of course, that same noise from the night before. This time I could make out where it was coming from. I perked up, listening intently to zero in on it. It was coming from the dresser stationed a few feet from the side of my bed I slept on. Confused, I walked over, still half asleep and in a daze. My blurry vision steadily focused on a dark object placed on my dresser. I picked it up and nearly fell to the floor. I felt my mouth open wide in a gape. It was my deer cam. No, I kept telling myself. It was impossible. Had I picked up the camera before coming home? Yeah, that had to be it, I thought. To be sure, I popped the SD card from the back of the device. I opened my laptop, the screen blinding my not-so-awake eyes. I shoved the card inside the computer inadvertently hard. I clicked the icon for the SD card that popped up. A window appeared listing hundreds of still-loading images. Yeah, I just don't remember taking the camera with me, I again assured myself. The pictures loaded and I was relieved. The first several dozen photographs were of deer, raccoons, a couple of opossums fighting over an unidentifiable artifact, probably garbage. I continued to scroll down, a laugh building up inside as I realized how silly I was for forgetting that I brought my own deer cam home. Then I froze, my heart refusing to beat for the moment. The environment in the next photographs was no longer the forest, it was no longer wildlife, because in the picture that now enveloped my screen, I lay sleeping in my bed. The automated slideshow perpetuated my horror. Each of the next photos were of me as well. I was in different positions, obviously tossing and turning as I slept. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something besides look on in terror, but the entirety of my body was paralyzed. The numbers of the pictures counted down, slowly approaching the last photo. When the final picture appeared, I threw the laptop across the room and ran out of my house. I jumped into my car and drove maniacally to the nearest other living soul I could find. I stopped living there. Any sane person would never go back after what I saw, but whatever was there with me has followed me. To this day, I hear the clicking at night. Whenever I walk on the streets or around my house, I hear cracking nearby. And when I hear those sounds, my mind reflects back to a picture I will never forget. The last picture on that long, forsaken SD card. The picture of me asleep, a hill of blanket apparent behind me, and the clawed hand reaching out from it and resting on my cheek. I live in the northeast of England, on a farm, miles from the nearest town or city. Usually it is rather peaceful. The closest I had ever came to danger before this event was when a fox started headbutting my front door. I wanted to let it in, but as soon as it saw me, it bared its teeth. So I let it continue until it knocked itself out. Afterwards, I contained it and placed it away from my house. I didn't want my Rottweiler, Remus, to suffer any damage, since he is really protective of me. That was my most dangerous, scariest encounter with an animal until now. 2 weeks prior to this event, Remus's behavior started to become strange. He usually lays atop of me when I'm in bed. However, he became restless. Every night he began to patrol the house, never sleeping or stopping at his water bowl. I'd hear him growl every once in a while, but I just assumed it was either a bird or hedgehog that he was growling at. My house is quite large, with a lot of windows, except for my bedroom. I didn't like the idea of someone potentially knowing when I was sleeping. During the day, I began to notice that there were a lot less creatures about. The farm that I live on stops at the edge of a forest, so creatures like deers and badgers tend to come onto my land. I have no problems with this since they don't bother my horses. About 1 week prior to this event, a policeman came knocking at my door, a first-time experience for me. He asked me if I had noticed anything abnormal, so I told him about the lack of animals, not thinking about Remus's change in behavior. After I told him this, he proceeded to tell me that the people who lived closest to me, about 4 miles away, had reported that all of their sheep had been slaughtered. After I heard this, I immediately became concerned about my horses. I thanked him for letting me know. Immediately, I moved the horses' stables closer to my house. If I saw anything, I could get out there. There was only one problem. You aren't allowed guns in England, meaning that if something were out there, I'd have to face it with either a small hatchet or my fists. I prayed that I never received a visit from the thing that had killed all of those sheep. A couple of hours before this nightmare took place, my clock broke. I go to bed early, around 9 p.m., so I can get up early and tend to the horses. This meant that I had no idea what time it was. Therefore, I was just going to go to bed when I was tired. Later on, when night fell, Remus started his patrol. I was in the kitchen with my back to the window, preparing a salad for the next day. I turned around to go to the sink, which was directly below the window. Remus walked into the kitchen, which diverted my attention from the window. I looked at him, yet he didn't look at me. He was fixated on the window, growling. I looked up at the window. What greeted my sight can only be described as demonic. A pair of yellow eyes, which seemed to be glowing, were staring at me. My eyes locked with its. My body seized up like a corpse. My heart stopped like it had hit a wall. It was only when the thing pressed its face against the glass that I noticed its facial features. A long snout, point ears, jagged teeth. All of this attached to a small skeletal head. It was bald, with some strands of hair pressed against its head. The thing began tapping on the glass with a long and pointy nail, which was connected to a bony finger. Its hands were huge. They would easily be able to wrap around my neck. It snarled, lifting up its skin flaps on the bony jaw. The thing's teeth were jagged and stained with a dark red substance, presumably blood. It looked like it was grinning at me. Suddenly, my heart began pumping, faster and faster. Adrenaline began flooding my veins. It was too much for my brain to comprehend. The thing at the window, my horses, Remus, my safety. Where the fuck did this thing come from? I let out a scream that must have deafened Remus. The panic that overwhelmed me was immeasurable. What was I going to do? There was no one around me, just me and this beastly thing. It started banging on the window with 2 huge and bony fists it wanted to be in. I took breaths in at an alarming rate, just standing there. The banging stopped. It then stood upright. It had been bending over. My window was about 6 feet off of the ground. Just how tall was it? I could no longer see its face. Its torso was thin, like an anorexic person with very little muscle mass. This ghastly thing's arms were weak-looking, with the entire arm looking like a wrist. Yet its nails were long and sharp-looking. It ran to the left. This sudden burst of movement made Remus sprint back out of the door. It was looking for a way in. I had locked every possible entrance, though. I was safe, for the time being at least. I couldn't have this. It would surely go after my horses. I had to confront it. It began banging on the window of the sitting room. I rushed into there only to be greeted with the full body. The best way to describe it was lanky. It saw me and bared its teeth. I had left the hatchet in the cupboard under the stairs. I sprinted to the cupboard and yanked the door open. Within 10 seconds I had the hatchet and was at the door. I said a quick prayer to God and dashed outside. Remus immediately followed me out, as much as I didn't want him to. I ran around the house screaming. The last thing I wanted was a quiet hunt. I wanted it to know where I was so I wouldn't be caught off guard when I saw it. I couldn't find it. As much as I was putting on a brave face, it wouldn't mask the fact that I was terrified on the inside. I made sure that Remus was next to me. I needed his hunting skills. Who was the hunter, and who was the hunted, though? This thing couldn't be found by neither me nor Remus. I stopped screaming. There was no point in wasting stamina or breath. I couldn't move for fear. A noise behind me would catch my attention, making me turn around. Nothing. A noise to the side. Nothing. I noticed that Remus was looking at the roof of the house. A sharp wave of fear swept over me as I began to look up. Surely enough, me and this thing locked eyes again. It was crouched down. It suddenly leapt at me. I swung and missed as it landed on top of me. We rolled on the ground until it positioned itself on top. It was heavier than its body let on. I couldn't move it. It attempted to bite into my neck, however. I managed to catch its skinny neck with one hand. I attempted to strangle it, yet its relentlessness wasn't ceasing. I saw its long arm begin to rise up, ready for a swing. Just before it had time to, Remus clung onto its arm with his jaw. He began pulling at it, managing to drag it off of me. This bastard then decided to go for Remus, getting on all fours and trying to bite him. Thankfully, Remus was too agile for it. However, it stood up, about to swing for him. I got up. I couldn't find the hatchet. The thing's arm was raised. All Remus was doing was barking at it. I charged at it and jumped on its back, wrapping my arm around its neck and squeezing. This thing's neck was not crunching or becoming smaller at all. Even with me on its back, it swung for Remus. The bastard hit his body, sending him rolling along the ground with a whimper. As soon as I noticed this, I flew into a rage, squeezing tighter and biting its ear. I bit the tip of its ear off. It growled and grabbed my arm. It flung me off. Too pissed off to care, I immediately got up and ran towards it. It swung for me. I just managed to raise my arm and block. However, the impact was enough to send me to the ground. It leapt on me, deciding to claw at me. My arm soon turned into a bloody mess. I couldn't hold it for much longer. Remus somehow managed to jump at it, tackling it off of me and biting down on its neck. This gave me enough time to get up, only for me to watch this thing stand up, with Remus still on its neck. I had to find that hatchet. Luckily, I managed to see a slight twinkle in the grass. I rushed over and picked it up. The thing grabbed Remus and slammed him onto the ground. Remus whimpered again. I gripped the hatchet tightly and sprinted. The bastard got on all fours and ran towards me. Even though it was on all fours, it was only slightly smaller than me. I swung down hard with it. I felt the hatchet plunge into its back, a satisfying sound. It was a short-lived victory, though, as once again it tackled me to the ground. However, I had also managed to pull the hatchet from its back. It went for my neck, but I managed to block with my arm. It bit deep into it. I screamed in pain. It sat up, staring at me with those piercing eyes. It had apparently forgot about the hatchet as I swung. The hatchet sank deep into its neck, its vile blood came gushing out. It roared in agony. It tried to swing for me, but I dodged to the right. I brought the hatchet out of its neck, swinging again and again in an adrenaline-fueled attack. More and more blood came gushing out, until I managed to lop off its head, revealing its neck bone, with about 1 inch of flesh. I quickly threw its lifeless corpse off of me. I immediately applied pressure to my wound, trying to stop the blood loss. I ripped a piece of my shirt off and wrapped it around my arm. A small whimper came from Remus. He began limping towards me. He wasn't bleeding, fortunately, but I could definitely tell that he had some broken bones. I got up and scooped him in my arms, barely being able to do it, but I had to. I looked back at the thing, its lanky body spread out, still lifeless and back to hell. I rushed to my Jeep, placing Remus in the back seats. It would be 1 hour before we reached the closest town. Luckily, the pet emergency clinic was open 24 hours. I ran in with him. A middle-aged man was at the reception. I simply told him that we were attacked. They took him and operated. During the operation, I drove myself to A&E. I had over 20 stitches put in my arm. Remus managed to recover successfully. It turned out that he had several broken ribs and a broken leg. They managed to heal him, though. It cost a hefty price of £6,000. As the sun rose up, I felt that it was safe to go to my house again. The drive back was a lot calmer and peaceful, with Remus still under the influence of anesthesia. I was dreading seeing that thing again, lifeless or not. Mind, I was also dreading not seeing it. Thankfully, it was still there. I was paranoid, not wanting to turn my back. I rang the police. The 2 policemen that arrived were completely bewildered as to what it was, although I spotted one of them on their phone in the car. Shortly after that, a black van arrived and collected it. The people were wearing biohazard suits and didn't say a word. As they were about to put its head into a black bag, I swear it was still looking at me. They left, and as the policemen were about to leave, one of them came up to me. He turned his radio off. He then said something I will never forget. "They are always watching. Best get out of sight." I asked what that meant, but he turned and walked. Who is they? What are they? And will I ever find out?